Thomas, can you believe it? 80 episodes of the Circa Sports show. We're here on this Monday. I'm Eric Eager, turning off the music. There's Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas, how you doing, my friend?
I'm good. I'm missing you here, but I will tell you, I know we miss each other. We go back and forth. What is it in Atlanta right now? 90-something? I mean, it's hot here. It's hot. Not like your Minnesota days.
No, and I'll be honest with you, like I'm really excited for the end of the day today. I found a gym that's about 6 miles away from my house, which is like perfect biking distance for me. Mm-hmm. And yet at the same time, I'm always a little bit nervous about biking in Atlanta because I don't know if we're going to talk about defensive linemen today. I'm not as big as a defensive lineman, but I'm like close. And like, I don't know if you really want me biking for 6 miles out in that heat. I think at 6 o'clock Eastern though is maybe my best chance.
Yeah, I've been watching. You guys all probably know that I'm a big Tour de France fan. And I sent you that clip of that guy the other day, the Frenchman who stopped in the crowd, chugged a beer and hung out with his people, raising the roof for about 10 minutes, and then started riding again. The reason I bring it up is every morning I go out and try to ride before I watch the Tour because that's the only time you can ride. If you try to go out at 11 o'clock like you try to, it's just not healthy. And so not sitting here proselytizing, of course. I want you healthy. I want you ready for the show. You look good, and we don't need you going down with some massive dehydration issue.
No, for sure. I have drank a lot of water today, but you're right. The best part is I have a membership to a gym. One of them's 2 miles away. One of them's 6 miles away. So like if there's ever a day where I get there and I get on the bike and I feel like I don't have it, then I'll just go to the gym that's 2 miles away. So I feel like I've given myself some outs as the poker and betting people would say. We do welcome everybody to the show. Matt Ungashik is here, says he loves the topic today. I do too. And this stemmed from one of our pals, Jason Fitzgerald, who runs Over the Cap. He posted on Twitter that there were more big money contracts now that have gone to interior defensive linemen recently than that have gone to edge players. And I find that to be very interesting. There's all this sort of discussion about whether that's just or whether we need to understand what the premium position is and how they're defined. And funny, so I did the show Friday. I kind of talked about it a little bit, but you're honestly the perfect person to talk to because I always feel like if there is something that's happening in the NFL that we're all kind of perplexed by, was it not happening in the Belichick tree? And of course, you're I think unquestionably the most successful person that has ever worked for Bill Belichick outside of those walls. But like when I look at your time as director of college scouting for the Patriots, and then I look at your time in Atlanta, you guys drafted high a lot of interior players. I look back to the Patriots time, and obviously you weren't there at the time, but Richard Seymour was a first-round pick in 2001. Jarvis Green was a fourth-round pick in 2002. And then when you were on the scene, Ty Warren was a first-round pick in 2003. Vince Wilfork was a first-round pick in 2004. And they didn't, as long as you were there, they didn't draft an edge player high. And then I look back at, the Falcons in your time, and you had Perea Jerry was your first-round pick in 2009. You had Corey Peters was a second-round pick in 2010. Rashid Hageman was a second-round pick in 2014. Now, I'm throwing him in here because he's ended up being the most successful of the bunch. Grady Jarrett was a fifth-round pick in 2015. And then Marlon Davidson, your last draft, was a second-round pick in 2020. Now, you did draft Vic Beasley and Tack McKinley as well. But the preponderance of draft picks that you had, both when you were in charge of college scouting as well as with the Falcons, were interior defensive linemen. And yet, I think most people who are knowledgeable about the NFL, but maybe haven't looked into it, would tell you that people value edge players more than interior defensive linemen. So I'm wondering, what's your base opinion on this as far as if you were looking at two players similarly skilled, one at edge, one at interior defensive lineman, which one would you lean towards nowadays? And what would you attribute this sort of evolution in the league right now?
Wow, there's so much to this topic, Eric, and we can roll with it for sure. So I'd love to go back and forth on it. First of all, let me say to answer your question, definitely we go to the outside rusher because I don't think they're there as often, and I think they do impact as that much more. I know there are anomalies out there, don't get me wrong. And I understand how important it is to get legitimate rush inside, right? Let's flip over to Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan, fantastic football player in my mind. Matt Ryan had issues like a lot of quarterbacks do with the interior rush, like legit interior twisting, pressures up the middle, right? To step up in the pocket is what those guys need to do. They need to do it with confidence. And if there's mayhem in the middle, it is a complete crap show, right? Their minds are flying around like crazy. We used to always say, Matt could slide back off the edge, off of some of that, the wide rushers, even the really talented ones, and do his little move up, step up, and have awareness in the pocket. But when those quarterbacks are stepping up and there's a lot going on in here, it's tough. So we know how important it is inside as well. One of my long-standing battles with coaches, and I will say your head coach and your D coordinator have a lot to do with whether you're spending money on your interior pass rushers or your interior players or not. When you draft or acquire an interior guy, Eric, and that interior player is literally playing, 40 or 35%, that is pretty tough as a general manager / team builder to put your resources in, and your resources are spent on 30-something%. We want those guys to be playing 80%.
Yeah.
So that builder is tough.
Well, and it's so hard because as an asset, and again, we don't want to dehumanize this, but ultimately as a general manager, you are acquiring assets. As an asset, those things don't age as well when you play them more. I mean, there's a reason Chris Jones has emerged. Now he's the next one up. And again, this is part of the conversation. He's the next one up to get a contract. Last season was Chris Jones, Thomas. It was his first time he ever played 1,000 snaps or more in a season. Like the Chiefs, for whatever reason, were playing him 500-600 snaps, 500-600 snaps, 700-800 snaps. And you think about now he's close, he's near 30 now. I can't remember exact age. But he's near 30 now. And it's like, well, don't you think some of and now they're like, well, he's really running into form now. And now he's getting to play every single snap. And now he's worth all that money. It's like, well, do you think, though, that playing all those snaps in some ways is a lagging indicator that he might not be in the future because of age, to your point? And so it's just a tough position because we've seen the best edge players, a lot of them end up aging gracefully into Dwight Freeney played for a bunch of teams. Robert Mathis was really good late into his career. Chris Dolman of Falcons 49ers was good into it. I mean, he had a 15.5 sack season at age 38 or something like that. A lot of those times, because you're not beaten up as much at edge, you're beaten up. Don't get me wrong. I'm not diminishing the physicality of that position, but you're oftentimes can avoid that they age better. But I think it's so interesting what you said because I think it depends on the opponent because I think a lot of quarterbacks prefer interior pressure because they're good at moving out. And if there's no edge pressure, you can kind of escape. Whereas if you have edge pressure but no interior pressure, there's nowhere to escape but into the middle of the defense. So it's sort of a weird dichotomy of who's playing who. Well,
look, what I was trying to say there is that's a great point. If you're setting up your team and you're looking at your division opponents and you're looking at what your quarterbacks within your division struggle with, you damn well better believe you're going to be doing some interior stuff. If your quarterback is struggling, your opponent quarterbacks are struggling with dealing with it. Of course, you get bona fide pass rushers on the outside. It is a bitch to defend them. But if your offensive linemen are sliding and these outside guys are able to ride them by, there's more of a chance to do that. I get it. And for a quarterback to step up, I used to forever would say, no way, this is all about outside rush, until I realized more and more quarterbacks were struggling with some of the twists and some of the important scheming that can happen inside. So I don't mean to be speaking out of both sides of my mouth. I love the outside. I am a lot more ripe and ready to go inside with pass rushers. Let me say this, however. I believe you're more apt to find a pass rusher inside who can develop into an adept pass rusher interior than you are to find a stud on the outside.
Yeah.
So maybe you do draft a guy like Grady Jarrett and build with him. He ends up being one of the better in the league. What a great investment that was versus spending really early. We spent way too early on Parade Jerry. And unfortunately, Parade Jerry had a blown knee and he never came back. We loved him. We thought he was athletic. We thought we were going to go for it. Mike Smith at that time told me, Thomas, this is the one place we're lacking. These D-line coaches who are D coordinators and head coaches who were D-line coaches, man, they have an affinity towards the big heavies inside. Yep. But we have to push them back a little bit only as GMs and say, look, is this truly worth the money or the space at the draft that we're going to do to get this guy?
Well, yeah, let's look at this a little bit because I come with data. So this is from our friends at Over the Cap. You look at the top paid edge players, right? And one thing you'll notice is there's just 7 guys who make $20 million a year annually. You're going to see more on defensive interior. But I think to your point, Thomas, Watt, Bosa, Garrett, Mack. Now, Crosby was a 4th-round pick. Chubb, Miller, Jordan was a 1st-round pick as well. Yep. I believe Landry was a day 2 pick. Barrett was an undrafted free agent, but again, that affected his market. Jones, a 1st-rounder. Agba. Now, Agba got screwed because of your Patriots, because Agba was the 32nd pick, his draft, but because the Patriots had to forfeit their pick, he was technically not a 1st-round pick. And then Reddick was a 1st-round pick. Henderson was a middle draft. But again, the guys that are being paid a lot, you have to find them very much at the top of the draft, and you're maybe making a scarcity argument, which is a good one. When you look over at interior defensive linemen, now you still see a similar thing. Like there's a lot of 1st-round picks here. Javon Hargrave, though, if I'm not mistaken, was not a 1st-round pick. I could be wrong. Chris Jones was not a 1st-round pick. Draymond Jones, like you still like a lot of these guys are picked high as well, but it's not in that like sort of top 10-ish range that you almost need to get a guy that's truly elite. And then the question is, you look here, there's 3, 6, 9 players. So there's more players that make 20 million APY than there are defensive, edge players. I guess the question is like, if you're going to make a scarcity argument, then are we just simply overreacting to really good play on the field by defensive interior players by paying them this much versus edge? Whereas we should just be more discerning about both positions.
By the way, these stats by Over the Cap are great. I love looking at this. Really good at entree into this, Eric, because it makes us really realize where we are and where we're paying our interior guys. So your question, however, I'm sorry, I was just a little.
It's interesting because I, upon first blush, didn't think so. I kind of made a point about edge, like, oh, these are all 1st-round guys. For the most part, the interior guys, like Quinton Williams is a 3rd overall pick. Aaron Donald was a pick in the teens. Payne Lawrence, a lot of Leonard Williams is a 3rd overall pick in his draft. DeForest Buckner was a 1st-rounder. Chris Jones was a 2nd. Vita Vea was in the teens. So you still have to pay up from a draft capital standpoint to get these guys. So I misspoke a little bit, but maybe it is just one of those things where you're just seeing a crop of interior players that have all hit, and with the exception of like top 10 picks, edge players just simply don't hit very much. Like Adafa Owe was a very good prospect, but he's not, Jalen Phillips had a pretty good year last year, but like when's the last, TJ Watt's literally the last like edge player taken after 12 to be a superstar Derek Thomas, Lawrence Taylor type player. Whereas interior defenders, to your point about Grady, Chris Jones, sometimes those guys can be found different places. And maybe that just means that there's more good players to be interior defensive linemen. There's just fewer at edge, but the fewer at edge should mean the ones that are truly great should be getting more money, shouldn't it?
Okay, so yes, when we look at this draft-wise and acquisition-wise, we would always look at the outside guys as these unbelievable athletes, right? And then a little bit of the overachieving inside. And if they're not overachieving, if they're really good athletes, you've seen some of them through your Vikings, the McDaniel, or people that were who I'm trying to think of some of the cats over the years.
So like I think of this because you talk about defensive line coaches, and there is no defensive line coach in the history of the NFL that was better than John Tierling. Yeah. And there was no better defensive line than Chris Dolman, John Randall, Henry Thomas, even and like Alnoga. But like, and this is where my worldview started on this. When they traded Chris Dolman to the Falcons, they tried to say, we're going to extend this. They had two terrible defensive ends and two stud defensive linemen, interior guys. And those interior guys got theirs, but a lot of quarterbacks were able to just like move outside the pocket and win, because as long as you can get in those guys' way, the edge players were playing patty cake with the tackles. And it was the edge player for that team, the true, and I know John Randall's considered better than him, but I think Chris Dolman was really the player that made that team go. And like, but it's your point, like even with that, right? Chris Dolman was the 4th overall pick out of a Pitt team that won 5 games when he was a senior. John Randall was an undrafted player out of Texas A&M something. Try hard guy, to your point.
Yep. So John Randall, I was misspeaking only on. I always think about Randall McDaniel because I think he's a hell of a player as well. When we're talking about John Randall, though, back to D linemen, fast, explosive D linemen who are a couple inches shorter than they should be. What maybe they just may not be as sort of, you're not that awestruck when you look at some of these guys and what they're doing interior, though. They're strong, they're leveraging, they're doing some pretty damn special stuff in their stunt games and et cetera, et cetera. I love seeing that. And I think let me lead into this. When you look at interior O linemen, right, back in the day, we'd always be talking about tackles. We'd spend our money, we'd spend our draft picks on the tackles. And we always thought we could get a really good guard at 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. We'd never draft up in the top 15 for a guard. I just think that has changed a lot. People aren't adhering to what used to be the way, right? Old school was you don't move up that many spots for a wide receiver. It's a whole different story, of course. Obviously, it's being done now. This wave of general managers are doing what they think is going to be best for their organization over the next 3 to 4 years, of course. It is a here and now league. We've talked about that many, many times. If they see a player in there that can be a difference maker, who's athletic, explosive, who, even though he might be a little smaller or might be a little shorter, that he can be a difference maker, they are drafting those guys. And then the big ones, the special ones, I'm talking about Quentin Williams, guys like that. Those guys are special, and people are jumping on them right away, right? They're saying, this doesn't come around but every 5 or 6 years. You better go after them. So then people get aggressive with it.
Well, and you see this. I want to bring up the run game in a second, because I think that may be where one of the key evolutions is. But you talk about Calais Campbell and DeForest Buckner and like J.J. Watt, those truly, men. Like you stand next to them and you're like, okay, I'm a different species than this person. Now, what's really funny is, and this included John Randall, who, to your point, was not a physical specimen. They all end up moving outside when they get older. So like J.J. Watt, the second half of his career was playing edge. Calais Campbell plays a lot of edge now. Cameron Jordan plays a lot of edge now. And I wonder if that's also not where I think historically we always said, failed edge guys could make really good interior pass rushers someday. And it's maybe the other way around, where there's more ways to win when you get an interior guy that has that bulk, that can actually do a few things, than maybe there was. We always thought sort of the other way around, where a guy who was, could bulk up and play on the interior, that's maybe not as much of something that comes to fruition. A guy like Solomon Thomas comes to mind.
Well, it's a great point. I mean, again, when you're building a football team, you want to make sure you are putting the people in the right places where they're going to affect the team, affect the energy, affect the toughness, affect the nastiness of that defense. And you're not thinking about that when you're putting a sweet pass rusher on the outside, right?
Yep.
But when you're talking about tone setting, these coaches, of course, are going to come to the table. And as general managers are saying, we can get this guy in here who's going to spin it upside down. He's tough. He's gritty. When we think about back to the days in the Patriots, when you think about Vince Wilfork, that was a tough dude. Now, those interior guys are tough. They have to take it from here, here, here. They have to get lambasted every which way but loose and come back, grinding it out. You're on the outside sometimes. You can do some avoiding. So I love the idea of bringing in a really talented interior guy that's going to set the tone for years to come. I think that's another consideration point.
Yeah, for sure. And let's also, like, when we talk about the Patriots during your time with them, the league was different, right? You ran much more of a true odd man front. You played a lot less nickel back then. So your your interior defensive linemen were much more two-gapping guys. And it's a little different than now, where I think some of the interior defensive linemen do have to two-gap, but a lot of them can rush upfield and be one-gap guys. And so there's a little bit of explosiveness too. But I mean, you guys, nailed it, because like not only obviously talk about Seymour, Jarvis Green, Ty Warren, Vince Wilfork. You just had so many players who would neutralize the run game too, and the run game was much more important back then when teams ran more closer to 50%. And this is, I think, where we can get a good question here too. Is like Sean Donahue, frequent listener to the show. Does it matter what else they're allowed to do schematically? If they allow you, so the interior defensive linemen allow you to play lighter boxes and are plus pass rushers, does it make you relatively valuable as an edge? So I think this is getting to the kernel of the truth. Matt also talks about the shift to more too high stuff, where, back in the Patriot way, you had, let's say you had Wilfork at nose, you had Seymour at 1-5 tech and Jarvis Green another 5 tech. Those guys were responsible for the same number of gaps, each guy basically. And you also had 4 linebackers, and the Mike Vrabel type edge is different than the edge now. You have to be more of a pure pass rusher to play that position. And you could bring a safety into the box. Nowadays, you're running like a 2-4-6 or 2-4-5 and 2-3-6, nickel and dime, where those guys have to occupy gaps that safeties used to be able to come up and help fill, and they're not anymore. And so if those guys could be plus players against the run, that even if they're only playing 50% of the snaps, because if you on first and second down get the other team to 3rd and 7, you're helping the coverage in a very indirect way because it's harder for the offense. It could that be part of the thing? Because we're seeing a lot of these analytical teams, Thomas, and I'm not breaking any ground by saying, the Browns, Chargers a little bit, who really understood the value of 2 high safeties and played them liberally over the last few years, but did not really understand the value of that interior defensive lineman to hold the point of attack when you have lighter boxes. And so they were gashed against the run. Mm-hmm. I think that's where you're starting to see the increase in value as well, is their impact on the running game.
So help me with this, because I want to make sure I'm following your question. However, that interior D lineman, lighter boxes, this was a big deal for us when we would have the wrong people in, right? I've mentioned this many, many times. Our substitution at times used to drive me nuts wherever I was, right? When you have a certain group in and the offense is coming down and they're reading who's in, and they're obviously making their decision on play calling, contingent on who's in, right? Contingent on who's playing against the run of the pass. Are you referencing that? Just so I'm clear, I want to make sure I'm not losing you on. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, yes, I would say having a nose tackle that is athletic enough to not be terrible brushing the passer when they do pass, but being big enough to be sturdy against the run. Because, you notice this too, because it used to drive you crazy. But teams have 2 different kinds of nickels. If you watch games, right, they have what I call a base down nickel, where they play 5 defensive backs or 6 defensive backs, but their front is a front trying to stop the run at least a little bit. And then they have I call long nickel, where let's just get 4 defensive ends on the field and they're all rushing the passer. I'm more concerned with that first group, where I think over time, not only have teams run more nickel and dime, but their defensive linemen have slimmed up. And so opposing offenses are thinking to themselves, okay, well, now I can run. And that's why you saw yards per attempt at a high last year relative to historical standards. It finally went up pretty highly, because teams were just they were daring teams to run, and teams were taking that gamble because their defensive linemen were simply too small.
Got it. Okay. So do you have a question for me, or is that?
So I'm saying, could that be part of the case, right? When you think about, when I look at this group of defensive linemen, I'm going to put up on the screen. Yeah. There are no designated interior pass rushers here. These are all guys, some more than others, like Vita Vea, of course.
Vita Vea.
But they're all guys that if you ran against them, they're not a cakewalk. And I think that might be because, you look at some of these edges, and none of these edges are for lack of a better term, patsies against the run or whatever. But you're never not going to run against a team because their defensive end sets a good edge. Like that's never a reason. Like there's never that impact there. But on the interior, like Quinnen Williams is a monster against the run and the pass. Jeffrey Simmons is run. And I think to myself, back 5 years ago when we're first starting the analytics revolution or whatever, 10 years ago, and you said, yeah, but he's great against the run and the pass. Like, yeah, Thomas, but you don't really want to have to pay for the run defense. Nowadays, you probably want to pay for the run defense because it's helping your pass defense.
Because it's helping your pass. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I just look. I don't know where we're going with this because I feel like we're spinning in circles here. I don't know if you want to head to another topic. What you're saying is correct. I agree with it. But I'm lost.
Yeah, I would just like. I guess my question is what could also be contributing to this imbalance? Is it just noise? Are we ready to see a bunch of edge players make a lot of money and hit, or is there truly like, are we better able to evaluate it? I think, given, some of the statistics that are out there, we're better able to evaluate the positions. And so the market becomes more efficient and the market changes over time. That could be one. Like, when you were an evaluator, did you find it easier to evaluate edge players or defensive interior players?
It was easier to evaluate the edge players, of course, because you could see the pure athleticism and the movement and such. The interior at times, of course, you had to factor in a lot of different things. It wasn't just their ability, of course, to first step, to shoot gaps, to play the run, to hold the point, but also the lateral leverage that we've talked. Scott Pioli will talk about forever and ever about the importance of lateral leverage when we're talking about the interior. There were a lot of elements to it, and sometimes it was boring watching some of those interior D linemen, and for you to put a big time grade on them when you've been seeing them just kind of holding. It's a little different when you're comparing some of those cats just flying off the edge doing unbelievably athletic things. So yes, it was easier for sure. But to your point, as we've gotten more and more, I think as the years have gone on, when people are throwing away some of what has been done forever, i.e. drafting only outside O-linemen early and the interiors, I just think people are doing what they think is best for their team, and they're going against what is the common or the norm over the history of the league. So that's a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. Do you think from a coaching and schematic standpoint, so I guess the question I'll ask is, if you have a weaker edge group, can you manufacture pressure more easily than if you have a weaker interior group? Can you manufacture all the things those guys do? They also think that that's one too, where I feel like Belichick looked at edge guys and is like, I can make that player into a star. Whereas if a guy's an interior player and it's like he lacks anywhere, it's just hard to manufacture those traits out of thin air.
Look, I have some strong feelings about manufacturing pass rush because I was in teams and around teams that we were in a real dry spell, and it got really, really unnerving because we would look at other teams and other schemes who were really capitalizing on some mid-liners, and I felt like we weren't doing that for some reason. I don't know why. It's not a dart at the coaching or the scheme, or maybe it is on the scheme. Maybe we just didn't have the scheme to capitalize on some of the midline players that we were drafting. But it did get frustrating for me because there was a spell there where we were lower on our production side, and we just could not manufacture. And it became
and that led to drafting Tack and Vic, right? In some ways too. And it's like back to what you've always said, which I think is really important, is like once you're drafting for immediate need, it just is really hard to have success. And now Vic had a big season for you guys the year that you made the Super Bowl, and Tack was just never that player. But it's interesting, right? Because like, what is it? So I want to hit on a bigger question here. Like, when you're a general manager and you don't think the coaching staff is getting, because it can be chicken and egg discussions, right? Like, hey, why are we not getting sacks? Why are we not getting pressure? And they're like, well, because the players that you've gotten me are not good enough. And you're like, well, sure, but these other teams are drafting players at similar positions with similar athleticisms, and they're able to manufacture pressures better than we are. Like, how does that is that conversation? It can't be easy to have, but is it had? And when it's had, what are the fruits of those conversations?
conversations are definitely had between a head coach and a general manager as far as the talent of the player and the scheme forever. If you have a good relationship with your head coach, you can get to the bottom of it oftentimes, right? And look, there are realities. There are times when you have defensive line coaches or defensive coordinators or linebackers coaches or interior coaches who really just aren't good developers of talent. So they've taken some of this raw talent and they just, for some reason, don't develop. Not saying all the time, because of course we miss on player evaluation all the time, just like some coaches are good at scheming, going up on the board, but they really don't hone in on, for some reason, development, right? And development is a big deal. But yes, when you start talking about looking and comparing, because that's what we'd often do, we would say, okay, well, we have 3 midliners here of our 6 or 7 D linemen, but so does Tampa. Why is Tampa's sack, why is their sack rate up exponentially more and they have 25 more sacks than us? What is that? I would always think that was much more of a scheme thing. And that became complicated, of course, right?
Well, and you've seen some of the things that I've been trying to work on with linemen, where it's like, I want to see, like, I think that conversation may, and you understand football far better than I do. It's like that conversation where you're saying, like, look, you guys run this scheme and this can be developed, this can't. And so we're giving you players who our internals say you can develop and they simply have not, right? Whether that be their bend, whether that be their lack of bend, whether that be their get off rate, whether that be, can I manufacture him pressures by running loops and stunts and all that kind of stuff? All that stuff. Like, I feel like, and again, like I said on the last show, you don't want to judge the past with the knowledge of the future. But if you were to have another opportunity at this, right, it would be something where like that conversation, I think, has to be a lot more direct. Maybe isn't the right word, but if you come armed saying like, look, like in baseball, it'd be like, look, this guy has 2 more inches left on his curveball that you have not somehow found. And we drafted this player with that knowledge, and we have not seen this. Is that you better have a good reason for why he's not developing, versus we got this real try-hard guy and there's really no more juice left on, left. And he can come back at you and say that the defensive line coach be like, look, he doesn't have any developer, he was an average prospect and he was fully developed, like being able to come up with having, and this is where we at Circa Sports, I think, want to add value. Being able to have that conversation in a data-driven way, I think will help alleviate a lot of those issues.
It will. I mean, and sometimes it's just simply that player, in this case, that defensive lineman, is just not jiving well with his coach, right? There's just something that is not working well. I know that's a simple way out of it. It's a non-data way to talk about it, Eric, but I want to always keep that in check, because I've been around that many, many times. And no one wants to hear this, sometimes the personnel department will draft a person and a player that position coach wasn't really behind, and it just has become tumultuous from day one. And that player can go somewhere else and start playing some ball, right? I mean, we've had players like that time and again who have left us or left at many clubs and gone on to thrive somewhere else, of course. So there is a human element to it that we just can't deny oftentimes. I wish that we could, quantify it. I'm hoping that you're going to come up with some unbelievable advanced analytics. It's going to, kick this company into oblivion as far as greatness. But, where are we with that, right? I mean, I'm just interested, if I could, before we go, if I'm coming back to you and I'm as a general manager and I'm asking you, all right, the data that you're going to provide me when I'm trying to decide as a GM, would I take this top-notch athlete on the outside or this player on the inside who's a really top-notch athlete as well? Are you going to approach that with me like, oh, just go with the best athlete? Is it contingent on scheme? How are you factoring that as a data scientist to come to me with your presentation?
Yeah, I'm gonna make you come up with like a job description for him, right? So like when I say that, I mean, and hopefully your friends are listening, because I think that this is not done this way, and I think it needs to. But you got to come and say like, look, this is a three down player who's going to spend this percentage at 1, this percentage at 2I, this percentage at 3, 4, and 5. as far as along the defensive line. And I want him rushing the passer from these positions. And I need to have, my designs for him are these comps, right? We all live in comps. Hopefully that's why I watch so much football, even though I don't understand it nearly as well as you. I want to have comps, right? And so then I can come back and say, well, look, if you want Grady Jarrett out of this defensive lineman, this has got to be his profile. This has got to be how he's played. And you're going to be like, well, Smitty's not going to play him that way. So it's like, well, then don't draft him. Like, you're setting yourself up to fail. And, there's some elements of a different company that do that where I was before. And, but you want to drill deeper even now that they have tracking data and stuff like that. You want to drill deeper. But if I'm looking at edge and you're like, look, I need this guy to produce like John Abraham did, I'm going to be like, well, the only way you can do that is if he plays 20% of the snaps. And you're going to be like, I'm never going to get behind a first-round pick playing 20% of the snaps. Okay. Well, I'm like, look, you're going to be – because it was funny, and I don't know if you've watched that quarterback documentary yet, but the coolest part about the Cousins part is Kevin O'Connell rooting for him, even though he's very imperfect. And the worst part was Mike Zimmer, when he was the Vikings coach, I always felt like he didn't want to have the quarterback there that was there. And I'm not saying he was rooting for his prediction, but you never want to put a decision maker in a position to want to root for their prediction when that means you guys are going to fail. You know what I'm saying? So like if you and I have a disagreement on something and you end up making the choice, it has to be functional enough where I'm going to root for the player you choose. Of course. And I sense that always isn't the case.
No, it's definitely not the case. I mean, there are a lot of layers to that, of course.
So if I give you here's how he wins, and you agree to take him and play him that way, then we no longer are rooting for our own prediction. We're rooting for the system to work. You see what I'm saying? So if I say this guy can only work as a designated pass rusher, and you take him in round 3, then I go from rooting for him or against him to rooting for them to use him the way that he should be used, which to me is a rooting for the team, independent of your opinion of the player, which to me feels like the right way to be a decision maker, is to root for the system.
Okay. And then I step back a little bit and I think, okay, I know that I can put my eye on anyone, just like any general manager or former general manager that is good, think they can go, evaluate anyone, right? That's just the pure physical side of the player. What I didn't do an adept enough job at or spend enough time at is digging in to the deep analytics of the differentiating elements, right? So I would come to you and say, okay, I love this guy. I think he's a 7 athlete. I think his lateral leverage is this. I think, go through the metric tree. He was, 7s and 8s in a lot of different areas. In our grading scale, by the way, everyone, the 7 is very good and the 8 is excellent. But what we didn't do is go into, I would love to come back to you as respectfully, my assistant general manager, and say, Eric, we need to go to another layer on this. How was this player versus this player and this player? How truly were their opponents? What were their opponents? What was the data against the opponents that they were playing in college? How were the systems? What were the historical elements of the coaching staffs and the schemes that they were using? Why was he thriving? When I watched this player, man, he's doing everything athletically, but every once in a while he's flailing around. Why is that? There are elements and layers that we don't tap into enough as general managers in this league that I think is the oyster. The world's our oyster. Like,
well, you have to be able to do that, Thomas, right? And that's where the rich play-by-play data and the stuff that we talked about on last Monday's show matters so much, because I want to be able to look at every play where he looped, right? And I want to either throw that out of the data set or keep that for a different time. But I don't want to evaluate him rushing as a looper versus a different guy rushing upfield. Like, it's all that stuff where you want to make it apples and oranges, and you want to, because again, we can watch a player, and I think watching a player for what is good. But if you want to watch a player for what is in like bunch of, like, your eyes are going to play tricks on you in that case, right? Like, we all, tons of statistics will say, like, the basically estimating probabilities and proportions are just really hard for people. So if I say, like, you tell me he's a 7, I'm going to believe you. If you tell me he's a 7 on games up front as a defender, I'm going to be less confident, just because I don't know. Like, the more and more you have to differentiate that tree, I think it's the more analytics come into play, just because it's hard for the human eye to sort of track all those things. And so, like, that's, I think, what the promise is of our scouting. Like, I think all those things, that's the promise, because I want you to come in and be like, look, defensive coordinator's on his last year. I need a guy who's going to be good no matter what the scheme is, versus it's our defensive coordinator's last year, and it could be my last year. I want a guy who's going to crush in this system. You know what I'm saying? Like, those are two questions that have two different objectives.
Well, no question about that. I'm sitting here daydreaming about what we're talking about right now, and I'm thinking, okay, I've said this to you and everyone when we were talking about breaking down positions. You need to grade and analyze the opponent. If you have an interior D lineman who's got 12 sacks or 15 sacks, had a great year, and yet 3/4 of those sacks against a lame-o who's blocking them, we need to find out exactly how lame or how good the opponents are. That's a whole other area. Let's take those 15 sacks and let's run the numbers on the players that he had the sacks against. I think there are layers that way that aren't dug into.
Right, even like Jermaine Johnson, who Joe Douglas has done a great job drafting. He drafted both. So far be it from me to criticize him. He had both the offensive and defensive rookies of the year last year. But his other first-round pick, Jermaine Johnson, had 30. I think he had 46 pressures as a final player to Florida State. 9 of them were against Jacksonville State, an FCS school. So even stuff like that, to me, needs to be recalibrated. But this is a good discussion. I wanted to pick your brain on something. I left it kind of open. The fact that we stopped and started during this pod is my fault, because I literally just wrote notes on a page with no kind of like, so I was really just trying to tap into your thought process on this. I thought that was really good. Really appreciate just getting to talk to you about it. Because again, it's a thing where, for everybody who's listening, this is like a value. If you can go back and remember the league just even scantly enough to go back, because in my mind, I was like, I don't think the Patriots ever took an edge player high when Thomas was there. And I went back and looked, and it was actually true. Like, if you have that intuition, like, just read a lot of newspapers and Pro Football Reference. Maybe you can get there, because it was a fun conversation, because you very, like, through my talks with you, you've always very clearly valued edge. But historically, like, that the actions have been that you guys like a lot of interior defensive linemen, which is really cool. And of course, most of them, I think Corey Peters was quite good. Obviously Jarrett was amazing. And the guys who drafted with New England were all home runs. So it was always kind of fun to chat through that.
Well, I appreciate it. I know we had a little bit of a standstill there, and that was only because I wanted to make sure we were going the right direction. Let me say this. I love those big interior guys I just want to get them in the 4th and 5th round. Not always, of course. The special ones, of course, you're going to draft in the 1st round. When you see those really stud-like athletes on the outside, and we've talked about this, a lot of great-looking athletes. We experienced it with Vic Beasley, who just ultimately didn't have the drive and the passion for this game to continue on for years and years. He led the league in sacks. Unbelievable guys out there like that fall by the wayside. There are a lot of mistakes made on the outside rushers, of course, and that's because we all need them. We're overly driven towards the need. So we could talk about that next time as well.
Yeah, I think your point that it's really hard to be a good edge player when you don't look the part, and it's easier to be one when you don't look the part on the interior. I mean, look, Aaron Donald's only 6'1". That is a very insightful comment that I think is one of the reasons why you're seeing the disparity that you're seeing right now. This has been great. Before I forget, we are sponsored by Circa Sports. Go to circasports.com. We are helping out this year. We're doing a couple podcasts for them when they are doing their Millions competition, when they're doing their Survivor competition. Again, the best sports book in all of the United States. Go to circasports.com and look up their different contests. They're signing people up all the way until the end of August. Should be a good time. A few of us will be out there towards the end of next month, so it should be a good time. As far as Sumer Sports is concerned, very cool updates. Beginning of August, we're going to have some more new stuff on the website. Hopefully you guys will like it. Newsletters, things like that. beginning of September, we'll have basically the full launch of our new website. Fingers crossed and all of that. We know that you guys will love it. More good podcasts, of course. And Thomas and I aren't going anywhere, but more cool new stuff at Sumer Sports. So in the meantime, subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our email list on the website at sumersports.com. We have a new article up there today. I had the pleasure, Thomas, of previewing the NFC North, my hometown Minnesota Vikings, ringing in there, trying to repeat a 13-win season from a season ago. So for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 80 of the Sumer Sports Show.